Thank you so much, Debbie. There are, growing up, a varied number of questions that seem to be kind of universally asked by kids, especially kids in school. So, for example, likely you had a math class at some point, or maybe a stack of math classes where there were gobs of things that you were taught and that resulted in homework that you had to do and exercises you had to do and tests that you had to take, involving stuff where you said, what's the use in learning this? Why in the world am I learning this? For example, I remember sitting in a calculus class as a senior, and the problem might have been there is an 8-foot ladder leaning at a 30-degree angle against a wall. How fast is it going when it hits the ground if it falls? I can't tell you how many times just this week I have used that. I mean, I was working on Wednesday's Bible study, and like it occurred to me, if that has been so amazingly helpful. Now, tax time is upon us. You're probably, and I haven't yet, I'm getting ready to start getting my stuff together to get my taxes filled out. And knowing how fast that ladder is going when it hits the ground, leaning at a 30-degree angle against a wall, I can't tell you how helpful that has been to know that. My car is getting its transmission rebuilt, which I'm very excited about. And knowing how fast that ladder is going when it hits, I'm telling you, if I didn't know that, I don't know where I would be. So I've asked that question, why exactly am I learning this? Well, and you were learning this and you were doing these exercises because you were told to do it. You were told to do it. Now, especially as a child, as an adolescent, there are gobs of things that you are told to do. For example, something that we regularly say, or at least frequently say in our home, is to say to our children, go clean your room. Go clean your room. Because invariably, it looks like there's a homeless encampment. But we are no longer deceived by their disappearance. And by that, I mean, it seems like for a while they were operating as though if I just go away for like 30 or 45 minutes and they don't see me and I come back, well, then the assumption is I've been cleaning my room. So when they show back up, what you have to do is to say, all right, let's go look at it. Let's go look at it. And typically what has happened is that things have been shoved in various places that are just kind of out of sight. And I'm okay, honestly, if you can just walk in the floor, I'm on the floor and not stand on stuff, I'm kind of okay with that. But so many times what will happen though is we'll see that. They have picked up, but then the bed just looks terrible. It's like, you need to make your bed. You need to make your bed. And in response to that, so many times we've had this. Well, what's the use? I mean, nobody is going to see it. And tonight, come bedtime, it's going to look like this again. So what's the use? At that point, you pull out your draw 4 card. Because I said so. Because I said so. Now, as parents, there are plenty of times that you wind up having to use that card, because I said so. Or those in management say and give things to do, and it has to be done because you say so. And that is a legitimate reason, but in truth, that's not necessarily a preferable reason. So, for example, you could go buy a car, and as you're purchasing that, they would say to you, hey, make sure that you change the oil. Change the oil. You need to do that. Well, do you change the oil in your car because the dealership said you should do this? No, well, that is a reasonable thing for them to have said, but ultimately, why do you do it? Well, because there's a far greater benefit that your engine does not seize up. Right? I changed the oil in my car so that my car keeps going. Yes, I am told by the manufacturer, maybe told by the dealer, by the salesperson, hey, do this, but there is the greater benefit that it keeps. It is sufficient that we do things because we're told to do them, but oftentimes there are far greater benefits that, if we think about, that provide greater rationale as to why we do some things. Hold that thought for a moment. We have been, throughout this month, working through a series that I've called Vital Signs, where we are thinking about some of the key essentials that characterize the early church. You see them described in Acts chapter 2. We talked about being biblically grounded. We talked about being meaningfully related. We talked about being gospel-focused, gospel-centered, And today we're going to be talking about being prayerfully focused. Now, all four of these essentials, that's how we have just phrased them, but in Acts chapter 2, you read that. It says they committed themselves to the apostles' teaching, the breaking of bread, the fellowship, and to prayer. So those four essentials, that's just how we have rephrased them here. But today we're thinking about this whole idea of being prayerfully focused. And with that in mind, there is this thought that God wants me as his follower individually and collectively as a fellowship of believers, he wants us to be praying. Has God told us to do this? Yes, he has in his word in a very number of ways, in a very different number of places in his word, communicated to us that we should do that. Is it sufficient for God to say, do something, and I expect you to do it because I said so? Yes. But is there any other reason that this should be an essential part of our lives individually and collectively? That's what we want to think about today. Because yes, it is sufficient for God to have said, do this. But what I want you to see is that based on his word, he's shown to us there is even more than that, far greater benefit for us ensuring the fact that prayer is an essential part of our DNA and who we are and how we operate as individuals, as families, and as a church. So why should prayer be an essential part of our lives? Look with me today to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We're going to look at just two verses here, but we're going to back up in just a moment to get some of the greater context. But verses 8 and 9 of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul says this, concerning these things, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Therefore, I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may reside in me. What we're going to see today is that I really believe God in this passage uses Paul to help answer that question. Why is it that prayer should be an essential part of my life as a follower of God and an essential part of who we are as a fellowship? Based on what Paul says here, the first thing I would say is this. It helps me understand the truth about myself. It helps me understand the truth about myself. We didn't read this, but if you were to look just back at the beginning of this chapter, Paul says in verse 1, boasting is necessary, if not profitable. But I'm going to move on to visions and revelations of the Lord. In verse 2, he says, I know a man in Christ who was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Most New Testament commentators believe that when he's saying, I know someone who had this vision where they were caught up in this vision, able to catch a glimpse of heaven, Paul's talking about himself. He's just referencing himself in third person. And whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows. I know that this man, whether in body, God knows, was caught up in paradise, heard inexpressible words which a human being is not allowed to speak. So I believe sincerely he's saying, I was able, good night, I was able to see, these glimpses, these sounds, these sights, this behind-the-scenes glimpse of what others will see later, I caught a glimpse of now. And it was on the heels of that Paul begins to describe something. He says in verse 7, he says that he experienced a thorn in the flesh that was given to him, a messenger of Satan to torment him. Well, so you've got this statement, a thorn in the flesh, and then a messenger of Satan to torment or buffet him. Well, what exactly is that? Well, the word that's used there that's translated thorn could be used to describe an instrument used for stabbing or impaling. I don't think Paul is suggesting that he had somebody like prodding him with a needle at some point or sticking him with a hot iron. And I don't believe that it was something that existed simply in the spiritual realm where he describes this messenger of Satan to buffet him. We can't say with certainty what it was that he was experiencing, but it does seem, whatever it was that Paul was going through, he was experiencing for 2 reasons. One, because God sent it, and he was experiencing this because it was negative. It was an adversity. It brought him some sort of discomfort. It seems that it brought him some actual and legitimate physical pain. Well, if you are hurting, and if there is one who is causing you to hurt, you know what you're prone to do? You say, whoever's doing that, stop that. You know, if your sibling has got you in a headlock and your neck is hurting, you say, quit that, right? If you are hurting, you want the one that is causing this to stop that. And so Paul says that I experienced this, and concerning this, what did I do? I talked to God. In fact, he says, I pleaded with God, not once, not twice, but 3 times, that this might be taken from me. Paul understood that he was experiencing this because the God who made everything is in control. And he hasn't abandoned his post, and he is keenly aware of what is going on. And Paul realized that the one who made everything can cause this to stop, and so I'm going to ask him to stop it. And in short, the answer that he received was no. And like a child who asks their parent for something, when the parent says no, what do? Sometimes you may wait a little bit. Let's try this again. Maybe we get a better argument. Maybe we catch them in a better mood. Maybe we, just by sheer persistence, maybe we can get a different answer. So he's asked one time, the answer is no. He asks a second time, the answer is no. He asks a third time, and the answer is no. We could say, and it is the truth here, that we can cite Paul as a good example of what we can and should do. And that is that when you are experiencing and facing adversity and difficulty, that you talk to God about it. You got a problem? In fact, the song says, are you weak and heavy laden, cumbered with a load of care? What do? Take it to the Lord in prayer. Paul does that. And so you say, well, hey, Paul's a good example of experiencing adversity and then going to God in prayer. But then you say, wait a minute. Maybe he's not, because he asked God and God said no. He asked God again and God said no. He asked God 3 times and God said no. Maybe this is not such a good example, but I'm telling you, it really, really is, because through this experience of actually talking to God and depending on God and coming to God and saying, listen, if this changes, it happens because you do this, Paul discovered something to be true that he did not otherwise know. And he says what it was. He says, so that I would not exalt myself. In fact, he says it twice in verse 7. So that I would not exalt myself. What I want you to realize is that God had blessed Paul with an amazing ministry. You know this to be true. I mean, 13 of the 26 books of the New Testament, Paul is the author of. He's the greatest missionary in the history of the Christian church. And every believer outside the area of Israel and the Holy Land that we know today can ultimately trace their coming to know Christ to the ways in which God used the Apostle Paul. Amazing, amazing experiences. Amazing ways that God used him. To say nothing of the fact that he got this vision of heaven that other people have never, ever, ever been able to experience. All of these are reasons for Paul to start thinking, well, look at me. Look at me. All of these are reasons for Paul to start thinking of himself to be, I got this one. All of these were reasons for him to be thinking of himself as self-sufficient. All of these were reasons to think of himself as independently capable. And so he experiences this thorn in the flesh and he calls out to God, and God says no. And in the process, Paul discovers something that was true of him that he didn't likely otherwise have any idea of. And that is that he was prone. And this is not something that he exclusively would be, but he realized that he was prone to pride, prone to having a big head. And the sheer experience of talking to God, and notice this, and God saying no, Paul discovers this to be true of himself. Listen, it is the case that you and I, as followers of God, should be those that are talking to him regularly. And there is nothing that you and I do that says to him, it says to us more than prayer, that says, I am dependent on you, I need you. But what I want you to understand is that, yes, God said to do this, yes, it expresses dependence, but there is this markedly significant, intangible benefit, and that's this. You will come to discover the truth about yourself. You will come to discover things that are the case of you that you would never, ever, ever otherwise have known. I don't think that Paul would realize the pitfalls that were out there for him to be so self-reliant and so independent, and didn't realize that maybe he was heading towards that way. But in talking to God through prayer, even in God saying no, Paul came to know the truth about himself. Caroline and I this year are going to celebrate our 20th anniversary, and the things that I have learned about Caroline in 20 years is significant. And I know her so well today, and I know her so much better than I did in 2004. And those of you who are married, you know your spouse today so much better than you did in the past. I get that. Marriage teaches you a lot about someone else. I've said this before, though true, and I can't underscore fully how much I believe it to be true. But I believe, perhaps even more than I have learned about Caroline, marriage has taught me so much about me. I mean, stuff about me that I had no idea about. And in fact, there were a fair number of suppositions that I was operating on that just simply were not true. Like, for example, you're aware of this, I like to laugh, right? And so the assumption is that by virtue of me liking to laugh and enjoying life, that I'm kind of a roll with the punches guy. You know what? That's not me at all. I'm not a roll with the punches guy. I have in my mind how things should operate, how things should unfold, and you know what happens if they don't? I complain. In fact, I'm really, really good at it. In truth, I mean, until we got married, I mean, for 29 years, I thought, hey, I'm a roll with the punches guy. Nope, that's somebody else's name tag, but it's not mine. I like to laugh, and if everything's going okay, I'm going to smile. But if it's not going how I think, you're going to hear me complain. I think I also thought that I was a guy that probably had like an unbroken chain of good ideas. Well, I didn't say anything funny there. I don't know. Because, like, I would suggest things, and people around me, they would do that. They were kind of going along with what I said. And I think I thought that, I'm just a fountain of brilliant ideas. That's not me either. Turns out I had a lot of people around me that didn't want to hear me complain, so they'd go along. But all of these are lessons that I have learned about me being in regular relationship and communication with Caroline. So much I've learned about her, to be sure, but so much I have learned about myself that I would never, ever, ever, ever otherwise had any idea about. Yes, it is that you ought to be praying, that prayer should be an essential part of my life, that it ought to be part of the regular expression of what we do collectively as a fellowship. An essential part. Essential. It means that we don't do without it, that we don't operate meaningfully without it. And it is the case that we should do that because God said to do so. But even more than that, we ought to say, you know what? There are things that I'm going to discover about me that I had no idea about unless I talk to Him. There's the truth about us collectively as a fellowship. We may think that we are one way, and by appealing to God, we come to see that's not the case. Listen, sometimes hearing the truth about yourself and discovering the truth about yourself is an encouragement. It is. Sometimes it kind of comes as a kick in the rear end. Does that feel good? No. But it is nice to know, it is beneficial to know where those weaknesses are so that you are improved, so that you are able to strengthen, so that you're able to grow. Listen, unless and until prayer is an essential part of our lives, a part of the core of who we are, there is so much that we're not going to know about ourselves individually, so much that we're not going to have any idea about the truth concerning us as a fellowship until we're talking to Him as an essential part of who and what we are. It helps me see the truth about myself, but beyond that, it helps me to see the truth about God. It helps me to see the truth about God. 3 times Paul has pleaded that God would remove this thorn in the flesh, whatever it was. And from Paul's perspective, he's asking God to remove this because initially he's thinking, man, this is slowing me down. I am hamstrung. This is slowing the advance. This is impeding the process. And if God could stop whatever this is, then that's going to grease the wheels. It's going to grease the skids, and things are going to be much better, not just for me, but for the kingdom's advance. And 3 times God said no. But God didn't just simply say no. Verse 9 says that God responded to him, "My grace is sufficient for you." My grace is sufficient for you. No, my grace is sufficient for you. That's not what Paul was wanting. That's not what he was looking for. What he was looking for was a reprieve. What he was looking for was the pause button, the stop button to be pressed, for this circumstance to be one where he could be ejected from, so he wouldn't have to face this anymore. And God does not say, "Yeah, let me do that for you." God says, "No, my grace it's sufficient for you to keep experiencing this." That's not what Paul wanted to hear. Paul was wanting this pain, this discomfort, this adversity, whatever it was, to stop. And God's saying, no, but what I'm giving you is sufficient for you to be able to endure it. Now, on the surface, you might say, well, that could be a cop-out. That could be a cop-out on God's part. Maybe it is that God couldn't do something about it, and so he says, "No, you've got enough there to take care of this. I'm giving you enough to take care of this." It'd be like, for example, me saying, I can deadlift 1,000 pounds, and you say, "Go carry that gallon of milk," and I'm like, so what I said I could do and what I could actually do, there's a disparity between the two. And maybe God is saying, "Oh, I have all power," and then you're like, "Okay, use it," and like, "Well, no, what I have given you is sufficient." Is it just a cop-out? Is it that God couldn't do something about this? No, in fact, the text tells us that God's the author of this. God's the one that started this in the first place. And so the one that can start it can absolutely stop it. Far beyond that, the one who speaks everything into existence can cause this to stop. It is not a big deal for God, yet he chooses not to. Why? Because he wanted Paul to see something. He wanted Paul to discover something that otherwise he would have had no idea about. And that was that regardless of the circumstance that he found himself in, God is saying that my grace is sufficient for you to be able to endure that. If I don't press the pause button, what I'm giving to you and what I will bring to bear is sufficient for you to keep on going. If I say yes and it stops, that's going to be sufficient. But even if I don't, I am going to give you, and what I bring to the table is absolutely sufficient. Oftentimes it is never more, but it's not a bit less than what is needed to actually experience this. Beyond that, God continues by saying this: listen, my power is perfected, or literally made whole. It's demonstrated that it's lacking nothing in weakness. What he's coming to discover is something about God that maybe thus far he had not quite gotten in his mind. When he says that, when God says to him, "My power is perfected in weakness," what he's saying is when you have decreased ability, when you have limited ability, when you have no ability, if anything is accomplished, that demonstrates my great strength and power. For example, a year and a half or so ago, we bought a generator at Costco, and our power was out. Actually, because our power was out, I went and bought it because we'd been having a number of issues with that, and it wound up it's going to be out for like 25 hours. And so we didn't know it at that point, but I bought this generator, and I don't know, I think it produces like 3,000 watts, something like that. Well, how much is that? I don't know, 3,000 watts. What can you run with that? I don't know, something less than 3,000 watts. And so we get it home, and we start plugging in some stuff. Because we've got 2 refrigerators and a freezer. Why? Because we feed half of Greensboro. And so plug the freezer in, generator does fine. Plug the refrigerator in, generator does fine. Plug another refrigerator in. Generator does fine. Kind of hot. Let's plug a fan in. Does fine. We're sitting here. We plug the internet in. Let's plug that modem in. Well, it does fine. Well, we got internet. Let's watch TV. When I bought, I had no idea. I didn't know what that would power. But I came to discover what it would power when I had no power. Paul is saying to God, please stop this. And even in the answer of no, God is communicating to him, not only is his grace sufficient for the difficulty, but he is demonstrating the fact that God is interested in demonstrating his power, his ability, rather than Paul's, rather than mine, rather than yours, rather than Gate City's. And the only way that Paul would ever be able to see that is if his power gets turned down. That God is interested in making himself big, not me, not you. God is interested in demonstrating his greatness, not mine, not yours, not ours. And were it not for this, Paul would never, ever, ever have seen this. Listen, God is using Paul as an example for us to follow, that we ought to be people, and we must be people of prayer, and it's an essential part of our lives individually and collectively as a fellowship, because it does. It's like looking in a mirror, and it shows us the truth about ourselves, but it also shows us the truth about God. And there are so many things that we would never, ever, ever know unless and until we are dependent on him and coming to him in prayer. But the truth is, it's always been this way. It really has been. Throughout the whole of Scripture, you see this to be true. When Hannah prayed, she discovered that God was greater than infertility. When David prayed for forgiveness, he came to discover in ways that he had no idea before that God's grace is greater than our sin. When Solomon prayed for guidance and for direction, what he came to discover is that God has an infinite supply of wisdom, and that if there is ever wise perspective, that it comes from God. When Job prayed for relief from his misery, what he came to discover is that if there is anything that is good that happens in life, if there is any blessing that is afforded, it comes from the hand of God. When the early church prayed for the well-being of Peter, we saw that just the other week. When they called out to God and when they depended on God in prayer, what they came to discover, not only is God greater than the powers of government, he's even greater than the strength of physical chains and bonds. And when Paul prayed for a thorn to be removed, what he came to discover is that God's grace is sufficient regardless of the need and regardless of the difficulty, regardless of the adversity. All of these people discovered these things. Why? Because they talked to God in prayer. It became an essential part of who they were and what they did. So let me ask you this. What is it that you've been missing out on? There are, in each of our lives, some real and meaningful and dangerous blind spots that exist that are in direct relationship to the absence of prayer in our life. Because there's stuff that we've yet to discover about ourselves, things that we've thought to be true that simply aren't, assumptions that we have that are baseless, weaknesses that we have that are being overlooked because we're not talking to him. Beyond that, there are so many things that you can read about in his word and so many factual truths that you can read about, but so many things about God that you'll never personally discover to be true from your experience unless and until you're actually talking and depending on him in prayer. You're missing out on the truth about yourself. You're missing out on the truth about God. The question is this: is it going to stay that way? Maybe it is. Individually and collectively, we want to double down on and make sure it is the case. Individually and collectively, we are a prayerfully focused people. Won't you pray with me?